Have you ever felt a strange distance growing inside you? A quiet space between who you are becoming and the world that once felt familiar? It begins subtly at first, like a thin film of silence coating your days. Conversations you once enjoyed feel shallow, small, somehow too fragile to hold the weight of what's now stirring in your chest. People you once felt connected to start sounding like echoes from a life you are slowly stepping out of. And yet you can't quite explain it. You can't point to a single moment where everything changed, because awakening rarely arrives like lightning. It is more like dawn, slow, soft, and almost invisible until suddenly you realize the night is over. And with this new light comes a loneliness that you may not have been prepared for. Why does the journey inward always seem to begin with a step away? Why is the first gift of awakening not clarity or peace, but solitude? Perhaps because the truth, when it first appears, is not comforting. It is confronting. It shows you all the ways you have abandoned yourself, all the roles you've played to be accepted, all the masks you've worn to avoid disappointing others. And the moment you start removing them, you also remove yourself from the world that needed those masks in the first place. There is a particular ache that emerges here, a kind of spiritual homesickness, not for a place, but for a way of being in the world that felt effortless, a time when you weren't questioning everything, when you still belonged to the noise, when you still fit the expectations placed on you. But once you begin to awaken, you can't unknow what you've seen. You can't shrink back into who you were, even if that version of you had company, comfort, or applause. And so the path opens, and it is quiet. You start to notice that the people around you talk, but they rarely speak. They fill the space, but never touch the depths. They listen, but don't understand. You realize how much of your life was held together by your willingness to stay asleep, to follow, to agree, to pretend. And when you stop doing that, the shape of your life changes. The rooms feel bigger, the pauses longer, the smiles sadder. What once felt like connection now feels like choreography. This is the hidden loneliness of awakening. You begin to see clearly, and in that clarity you see just how much you once accepted simply to avoid being alone. At times you may wonder if something is wrong with you. Why can't I relax into old friendships? Why do familiar conversations feel empty? Why does my own honesty isolate me? Why does growth feel like loss? The truth is simple. When you outgrow your old self, you also outgrow the world built around that self. And it is not your fault. You are not broken for wanting something deeper. You are not ungrateful for questioning the life you inherited. You are not difficult for refusing to dim your truth to match someone else's comfort. You are awakening, and awakening has a price. It asks you to let go before you know what will replace what is lost. It asks you to trust the emptiness before it becomes fullness. It asks you to walk into the unknown before you feel ready. And the first step on this path is almost always a step into aloneness. But here is the paradox. This loneliness is not a punishment. It is an opening. When you begin to walk away from the noise, you start to hear yourself again. When you let go of the people who cannot meet you where you are going, you make space for those who can. When you step out of old identities, you finally feel the shape of your true one. The loneliness you feel is not the absence of others. It is the presence of yourself. A presence you have ignored for far too long. Yes, there is grief in this process. Quiet grieving for the versions of you that others loved, for the roles you played with such sincerity, for the stories you believed because they made life easier. You might miss the comfort of belonging even if it required abandoning your truth. You might miss the simplicity of old dreams, even if they were never truly yours. But mourning is not the same as returning. And you, perhaps for the first time, are choosing not to return to a life that required you to disappear. Awakening will ask you to sit in this strange in-between space, no longer the person you were, not yet the person you will become. It is here, in this liminal silence, that the mind panics. It wants to run back to something familiar, even if that familiarity was suffocating. Wants to cling to relationships that no longer nourish you. It wants to insist that something is wrong, when in truth something is finally right. For the first time, you are no longer negotiating with your soul. You are listening. And in that listening, everything changes. The world that once held you no longer feels like home, but the world that will hold you has not yet revealed itself. This is the loneliness of transformation, the sacred vacancy created when your spirit grows faster than your surroundings. But even in this emptiness, something tender is happening, a soft rebuilding, a quiet realignment, a subtle returning. You begin to find fragments of yourself you abandoned years ago, desires you silenced, truths you swallowed, boundaries you never knew you had the right to create. They rise slowly like petals pushing through soil, delicate yet determined, and you begin to understand that this loneliness is not the end of belonging, it is the beginning of belonging to yourself. Awakening will always feel isolating in the beginning, but this isolation is the cocoon, not the grave. You are not losing the world. You are losing the illusions that once hid it from you. You are not becoming lonely, you are becoming whole. You are not walking away from people, you are walking toward yourself. And though the path is quiet, it is not empty. It is lined with the parts of you that waited patiently for your return. And as you walk, step by slow step, you begin to notice something unexpected. The loneliness begins to soften. The silence becomes familiar. Your own company becomes less like exile and more like home. This is the hidden loneliness of awakening, the ache that precedes alignment, the silence that precedes truth, the solitude that precedes depth. You are not alone. You are simply arriving. Is Module 2 expanded into a full, approximately 1,000-word narration in the same reflective, poetic, Alan Watts-inspired voice. Number 1. The ego's fear of outgrowing attachments. Have you noticed how the moment you begin to grow, something inside you starts to panic? A subtle trembling in the chest, a quiet whisper that says, "Don't go too far, you might lose everything." This voice is not your soul. It is your ego, that fragile architect of identity, terrified that if you outgrow the old world, you will have nowhere left to belong. The ego cannot fathom expansion. It only knows continuity. It clings to what is known, even if the known is painful. It holds tight to relationships that drain you, environments that limit you, patterns that shrink you, not because they are right, but because they are familiar. And so the moment you begin to evolve, the ego reacts like a frightened child. It begs you to stay where you are, to keep the peace, to maintain the image others have of you. It doesn't care about your freedom, it only cares about your safety. The ego was built to protect you, but in doing so, it also cages you. Its fear is not proof that you are going the wrong way, but that you are finally stepping beyond the boundaries it once built to keep you small. When you start awakening, the ego senses danger, not real danger, but existential danger, because to the ego, change is death, growth is extinction, transformation is annihilation. It believes that if you stop playing your old roles, the world will forget you. If you stop being who everyone expects, you will be abandoned. If you stop shrinking to fit into their lives, you will lose the very people who made you feel needed. This is why growth feels like betrayal. Betrayal of who you were. Betrayal of who they believed you to be. Betrayal of the story the ego crafted to keep life predictable. But ask yourself gently, is it really betrayal to stop abandoning yourself? The ego fears outgrowing attachments because attachments are its lifelines. They are the mirrors through which it sees itself. They are the scaffolds that hold its identity in place. And when you evolve, the ego loses its reflections. It can no longer recognize itself in the world around you. It feels unanchored, untethered, drifting. So it fights, it urges you to return to old habits, to old circles, to old versions of yourself that no longer feel authentic. It seduces you with nostalgia, giving you warm flashes of the way things used to be, hoping you will step back into the skin that fit the expectations of others. It will even convince you that your growth is dangerous, that you are becoming too distant, too different, too difficult to love. But the truth is gentler than the ego's panic allows. You are not becoming difficult to love, you are becoming difficult to manipulate. You are not drifting away from people, you are drifting away from the versions of yourself that kept them comfortable. You are not losing connection, you are losing dependency. There is a difference. The ego fears this difference because it thrives on attachment. But the soul thrives on alignment. And when alignment begins, attachment loosens. Not because you are cold, but because you are clearing space. Not because you no longer care, but because you finally care in the right direction, inward. Ego is terrified of this inward shift. It has spent years convincing you that meaning exists only outside of you, in relationships, in acceptance, in validation, in applause. But awakening is the moment you realize that all of these were temporary anchors, not destinations. You do not belong to your attachments. You belong to your becoming. Of course, the ego fears this. It fears that once you grow, people will leave. It fears that once you set boundaries, love will vanish. It fears that once you stop sacrificing yourself, you will stand alone. But here's the secret the ego never learned. Anything you lose by being yourself was never meant for your soul, and anything that remains or returns is aligned, not attached. When you start outgrowing attachments, you are not destroying your life. You are revealing it. You are not losing your people. You are losing your distractions. The soul is not interested in the noise that keeps you numb. It is interested only in the connections that invite depth, reflection, honesty, and evolution. But before you experience those deeper connections, you must pass through the ego's storm. This storm is full of fears, disguised as logic. What if no one understands me anymore? What if I outgrow someone I love? What if my growth ruins everything? What if becoming myself means walking alone? These fears are not signs that you should stop. They are signs that you are close to breaking old cycles, close to stepping into authenticity, close to discovering a version of yourself that no longer needs approval to feel alive. The ego's fear is the final gate before transformation. And the loneliness you feel while passing through that gate is not a warning. It is a cleansing, a removal of anything or anyone that can't meet you where your soul is now leading you. Outgrowing attachments does not mean you love people less. It means you love yourself enough to stop shrinking for them. It means you are learning to remain true, even when others prefer the older version of you. It means you no longer stay where your spirit feels small just to keep the peace. It means you know, somewhere deep in the quietest part of you, that authenticity is worth the losses it asks for. The ego fears what the soul already knows. The relationships meant for the next chapter of your life will not require you to abandon who you are becoming. Let the ego tremble, let it panic, let it cling. It will settle once it realizes you didn't die, you simply evolved. It will soften when it sees that what you lose in attachment, you gain in alignment. It will trust you eventually when it finally understands that becoming yourself never costs you what is truly yours. For now, breathe into the fear. It is only the sound of old shackles loosening. And on the other side of that fear, freedom. Number 2, the quiet pain of shedding former selves. There comes a moment in every inner transformation that feels strangely tender, almost fragile. A moment when you realize you are slowly becoming someone you no longer fully recognize. Not because you are lost, but because you are outgrowing the version of yourself you once fought so hard to maintain. And this shedding, though necessary, carries a kind of quiet pain that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not lived through it. It's the pain of realizing that the person you used to be, the one who tolerated more than they should have, the one who stayed silent to keep the peace, the one who bent just to be chosen, is dissolving. That version of you is slipping away, and even though you know it needed to happen, there's a strange grief that accompanies the letting go. You find yourself mourning the very patterns that once harmed you, because they were familiar, predictable, woven into the fabric of your identity. We don't often talk about this grief. We speak about transformation, like it's some triumphant victory, a breakthrough, an awakening, a rising. But growth has a softer, darker side, a side that feels like sitting alone in a half-lit room, holding the remnants of who you used to be, unsure of what to keep and what to release. You may feel guilty for missing a version of yourself that survived by self-abandonment. You may feel confused by the nostalgia you carry for a time that wasn't truly aligned. You may even feel selfish for choosing yourself now, when for so long your identity was built around choosing everyone else. But this is how shedding works. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it doesn't announce its arrival. It comes like a mist in the early hours, quietly wrapping itself around the edges of your life, softening the outlines of everything you once believed was solid. And slowly, gently, it begins to loosen the ties that kept you connected to old roles, old stories, old versions of yourself that were never meant to accompany you into the next chapter. Sometimes the pain shows up as a heaviness in your chest, the kind you can't explain to anyone. Other times it looks like exhaustion, not from doing too much, but from holding too much for too long. And sometimes shedding simply feels like a quiet emptiness, a hollowing out, as though your soul is making space for someone new to emerge. Is a strange duality here. You are both the sculptor and the stone. You are carving away the excess, the untrue, the outdated, and feeling every cut as it happens. And because of this, you may find yourself clinging to pieces of the old you, even after they've begun to fall away. There is comfort in the familiar. There is safety in what you already know how to be. Even if that version of you was hurting, it was yours. And letting go of it requires an act of courage that is often misunderstood by those who have not yet met their own evolution. You may miss the way you once tolerated everything so easily. You may miss the simplicity of saying yes when you meant no. You may miss the numbness that came from not questioning anything. You may even miss the innocence of believing that belonging was something you had to earn. But missing these things doesn't mean you want to go back. It simply means you are human. Growth doesn't erase the past, it integrates it. It doesn't deny your former selves. It honors them by no longer forcing them to carry burdens they were never meant to hold. This shedding is not betrayal, it is liberation. And yet, liberation often feels like loss at first, because before you step into a new way of being, you must release the person you were trained to be. And that person, despite their limitations, tried their best to survive. They protected you in ways you might not fully understand until you look back with softer eyes. Perhaps the version of you that kept quiet was simply trying to avoid conflict in a world that felt too loud. Perhaps the version of you that overgave believed love had to be earned because no one taught them otherwise. Perhaps the version of you that feared abandonment had never known what it felt like to be chosen without conditions. These former selves were not mistakes. They were stepping stones. They were survival strategies. They were the scaffolding that held you together until you were strong enough to rebuild from within. But now the rebuilding has begun, and the scaffolding must come down. The pain you feel is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is dissolving, something that once defined you, but no longer reflects the truth of who you are becoming. It is the ache of transition, of identity shifting, of boundaries forming where none once existed. And while it may feel lonely, this stage of shedding is profoundly sacred. It is the threshold where your old life loosens and your new life has not yet arrived. It is the pause between breaths, the space between stories, the silence before the next truth reveals itself. You are not meant to rush this. You are meant to feel it, to sit with it, to let the old versions of yourself be acknowledged before they are released. And when you do, something beautiful happens. You begin to sense the emergence of a new self, quieter, steadier, more grounded. A self that no longer exists to be understood by others, but to understand itself. A self that doesn't need permission to exist. A self that doesn't negotiate its own worth. A self that loves without shrinking, speaks without apologizing, and stands without trembling. Shedding former selves is painful because it is the death of illusion. But it is also the birth of authenticity. And authenticity is worth every ache it requires. You are not breaking. You are unfolding. You are not losing yourself. You are meeting the version of you who has been waiting behind the noise. You are not grieving the end. You are grieving the beginning, because beginnings are always disguised as endings at first. Let the shedding happen. Let the old selves fall away. The pain is simply the sound of your soul rearranging itself into truth. Number 3, why people drift away when you change 1,000-word narration. There is a moment in every inner transformation when you begin to notice something unsettling, something subtle yet impossible to ignore. People start drifting, slowly at first, then unmistakably. Conversations that once flowed without effort now feel forced, as though you are speaking across a widening valley. The energy between you shifts, not through conflict, but through quiet misalignment. They haven't changed, you have. And the more you evolve, the more obvious the distance becomes. But this drifting is not personal, although it often feels like a quiet heartbreak. It is not rejection, although it can sting like one. It is simply the natural